Welcome to another episode of Skeeter's Travels. I'm Skeet. Today, I'm coming at you from the itty-bitty, blink and you'll miss it, town of Bowie, Arizona. Located right off of Interstate 10, Bowie is mostly known for its rows and 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 rows of pistachio farms. We are standing in an area that was central to a 30-year hostility between the Apaches and the U.S. government. Welcome to Fort Bowie National Historic Site, a park dedicated to preserving and showcasing the history of westward expansion through the famous Apache Pass. Experiencing this park may be a little different than other parks you may have visited. To get here, you drive through these amazing pistachio and pecan farms, through a valley, and then up through a mountainous area, which is the Apache Pass. What's unique about it is you don't start off at the visitor center. You begin your adventure 1.5 miles away at a trailhead, and then work your way to the visitor center, stopping at several points of interest along the way. For those of you wanting a less strenuous experience, you can also park at a parking lot 300 yards from here to do a much shorter hike to experience it. Or if you are wheelchair bound, you can call ahead, they'll unlock the gates for you, and you can park right here on the concrete slab right next to the visitor center. This national park is one of 7 parks in the National Parks system that participates in the I Hike for Health Challenge in southern Arizona. Each park has a number of miles that you have to hike in order to earn a really neat little commemorative pin. This park, you have to hike 3 miles. So if you park at the trailhead, hike to the visitor center and back to your car, you automatically qualify for the little pin. The first site is the mining cabin. The prospector here died in a mine explosion. The second stop you'll come across is the campsite for the Topographical Engineer Corps. They stopped here in 1854 in search for a railroad route. They hiked for 55 miles through the desert without water until finding this spot here. A year later, after that excursion, they found an easier route for the railroad, and the railroad was then completed north of here in about 1880. It's about 30 years later. This is the third site that you'll come across. Right here is where the seeds of conflict were planted between the U.S. government and the Apache people. In 1861, there was an Apache raid on a nearby farm where the Apaches kidnapped a farmer's boy. The U.S. government was called in to help with the affair. Lieutenant Boscom, a greenie from West Point, was charged with recovering the kidnapped boy. So he and his men set up camp about 200 yards that way, and they called up Chief Cochise and his men to have a discussion about what happened. Chief Cochise comes up and they hold him hostage in a tent. He's interrogated and denies kidnapping the boy. Chief Cochise escapes out the back of the tent, up and over the hills onto safety. However, his men are unable to escape. Let's go on to see what happens next. This next stop along the route is the Apache Stage Station. This would have been a stopping point for the stagecoach that carried the mail. These walls would have been 6 to 8 feet tall. Passerbys could have also stopped here for beans, coffee, bread for 50 cents a meal. After Chief Cochise escaped out the back of the tent over there, the soldiers from Lieutenant Boscom's regiment sought refuge over here in this staging area. The next day, Chief Cochise brought more men to the mountains that are south of here and kidnapped a stagecoach driver and attempted to use him in exchange for his family and men that were here. Lieutenant Boscom denied, and so Cochise kidnapped more people from here and attempted to use them as hostages as well. Again, Lieutenant Boscom denied, and Chief Cochise ordered his men to kill all of their hostages. Lieutenant Boscom retaliated by killing the Apache warriors that he was holding hostage. This would lead to a almost 30-year conflict between the U.S. government and the Apache people. The next stop along the way is the Butterfield Mail Trail. In 1857, this right here was established as a corridor for the U.S. mail to pass through. It was expected that the 2,800-mile trail would be traversed within 25 days to deliver dependable mail across the country. The stagecoach ran for about 3 years and ended in 1861, the same year that the Boscom affair started between Lieutenant Boscom and the Apaches. The sites that we're stopping at are not in any kind of historical order, they're just in the order of the trail. Here we have the cemetery that served this region. This cemetery was built about the same time as the post office was, which was before this was established as a fort. First came the Apache Pass, where people were able to pass through it because of the gold rush, and then we have the stagecoach coming through here, and then as a result of the Bascom affair, we have the fort being established. So this cemetery served all of those groups of people. We have mail workers buried here, we have military buried here, and we have civilians buried here. At some point, they exhumed the bodies of the military personnel and buried them out in San Francisco. One of the things that I find interesting is 3 Apache children are buried in this cemetery. One of which is the child of Geronimo, which is fascinating because Geronimo created a huge headache for Fort Bowie. Fun fact while we're hiking to the next site, this is Arizona's only hike to visitor center in a national park. It is also Arizona's least visited national park or national historic site. They receive on average about 8,000 visitors a year. Next up on our sites is the Chiricahua Apache Reservation Agency. In 1875, this area was established as a reservation for 900 of the Chiricahua Apaches. Now, we're jumping around in history again. The Bascom Affair happened in 1861, and the post office shut down in 1861. So we're now 14 years ahead of where we were just at. This was set up as a reservation in 1875, and then in 1876, Jeffords, the man running this place, passed away, and a good deal of the Apaches were able to escape, and they went down south and they raided villages in Mexico. However, about 325 Apaches remained here, and the government sent them off to the San Carlos Reservation. Let's rewind a few years and go back to 1862. A team of 96 volunteers from California were passing through this way to establish a supply depot. Now, we had Chief Cochise that we talked about earlier, and he brings in an ally, Mangas Coloradas. That means colored sleeves. There's 2 reasons why they think he was called that. 1, because he always rode into battle wearing a red shirt, or 2, because he was a fearsome warrior and his arms always turned red with the blood of his enemies during a battle. Chief Cochise and Mangas Coloradas brought a group of 140 Apaches here, and they attacked the tail end of that caravan coming from California, and that battle got ugly. The Californians chased the Apaches off into the mountains, where they were able to regroup at a water source a little bit further down that way. This would become known as the Battle of Apache Pass. This is Apache Spring. This water source right here is the reason for everything we see out here. We're in a huge desert, the Sonoran Desert, and this is one of the only water sources. We just went to the first part of the Apache Pass battle in 1862. So when the Californian volunteers prevailed over the Apaches regrouped over here. The Californians made their way up this way, and another battle ensued, and the Californians prevailed and the Apaches took off again. As a result of the Apache Pass Battle of 1862, down in there by the springs, 100 men from the California 5th Regiment came up here, and they immediately built a 13-tent fort on top of the hill to act as a defense. The new fort leader was charged with defending all people in transit through this area, and he was ordered by his commander to kill all Apaches on sight. The government wanted to have more of an offensive strategy than a defensive strategy. In order to do that, they needed more men out here. So in 1865, they started construction on the second Fort Bowie, which took about 4 years to complete. Let's go down there. And this is the second Fort Bowie, complete with all things that any other fort would have had during the time, including a mess hall, barracks for the cavalry. This is a better example of the barracks. This is where the cavalry would have lived. These would have had a really nice front porch. They would have had a pitched roof and kerosene lamps. They also would have had a little bit of landscaping going on. The inside was not as nice. They had the iron bunk beds, they had the rifle racks, and they had a wood-burning stove to keep warm in the winter. If you were an officer, your living conditions would have been a little bit better. And this is where you would have lived if you were that officer. Now, your rank and seniority in the military determined the luxuries that you got. It determined your house, your living space, how many stoves you got, and how much wood you got to burn in those stoves during the winter. I guess it also determined if you got a modern trash can or not. Like the cavalry barracks we saw back there, these houses would have had a patio. And in many cases, the officers' wives would have built gardens and attempted to grow their own food out here and do other things to make the house more homely. Now, what really sucks about all of this is if during officer rotations, somebody came to the fort that outranked you, you would have to give up your nicer house to them, and you would have to go to one of the lesser houses and potentially start all over again, beautifying your quarters. And a little bit higher up on the hill, looking down on the hoi polloi below, the cavalry, is the commanding officer's house. It was a 2-story Victorian-style mansion. It had abundant living space, 2 verandas, and 7 bedrooms. And as we know, all things are centered around water, so in 1885 they completed this water reservoir. The hospital steward's quarters and the hospital, a 12-room hospital, which would eventually house the hospital steward as well. Now, this 12-room hospital was complete with a dining room, isolation ward, dispensary, offices, bathroom, and then a large ward as well. As nice as it sounds, still would not want to have gotten injured or sick during this time. Of course, when you're in the military, you're provided with the uniform. However, the uniforms that they issued back then were inconsistent in size. More often than not, you had to take your uniform to the tailor, which would have been right here. He would have sewed, mended, and tailored your clothing, but at a cost which often cost more than the uniform itself. And this is the post exchange, or the post store, where military personnel could have bought the things they needed that were not supplied by the government, including toiletries, sewing supplies, and tobacco. A lot of eventful things happened here at Fort Bowie. In 1872, Chief Cochise, the leader of all of the things that we had talked about, the Boscombe Affair of 1861, the Apache Pass Battle of 1862, he eventually died. Don't know why, but when he died, the government relocated all of the Apaches to the reservation at San Carlos. But not all of the Apaches went. Some of them escaped. Geronimo was one of them who did not get sent there, and he led a 10-year-long raid throughout this area and throughout Mexico as well. It wasn't until September of 1886 that Geronimo finally surrendered. His people were sent off to a reservation. He actually avoided execution and was sent to Florida and then Alabama, and I'm not sure where it goes from there. But he essentially became a circus sideshow. He became a pop culture icon. He would sign autographs, and it just went on from there. I don't know much more about it. Before we hike back, let's stop at the visitor center to get our little hike for health pin. All right, I got my little hiking pin. Now it is time to do the 1.5-mile trek back to my car. I'm not taking you with me on that one because, well, you've already seen it all. Thank you for building memories with me on this adventure, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.